Science isn't separate from communities. What we find in science influences and can influence the decisions that happen in communities and have implications for people that live in these communities. So Chesapeake Working Land and Seascapes really embodies this idea that we start with both. We start with what we know by our training and what we know exists and where the gaps are, and we take that and we combine that with what is known by the communities and how can we use all of these aspects to shape how we think about science and conservation and a future that benefits both livelihoods and nature.
Chesapeake Working Land and Seascapes is a network of scientists and stakeholders who have come together to study the Chesapeake Bay watershed and restore healthy and resilient ecosystems for years to come. One of the reasons why this program is so unique is that it unites scientists from different disciplines to explore the linkages across terrestrial and aquatic habitats that support watershed functioning. These collaborations allow us to see a bigger picture of overall watershed health and deepen our insights into the long-term impacts of land and water use. We work with stakeholders and synthesize current and historical data sets to study ecological processes and uncover how habitats have changed over time. An example of this work is my project that traces the effects of human activities on forests over the last 40 years. Forest once covered 95% of the watershed, but after centuries of urbanization and agriculture, approximately half of the forest has been cleared. Most of what remains exists as islands bordered by fields, roads, and cities across the landscape.
We have a chronology that exists of forest fragmentation and how it's changed. So we have a record of how songbird biodiversity has changed. We have records in many places of how the plant communities are changing. But we haven't really looked at what that chronology means and what it shows in terms of how species might be adapting. We know many are sensitive to fragmentation. We know many don't seem to be sensitive to fragmentation. And so my current work focuses on trying to piece together that chronology instead of continuing and looking at this question another 10 years from now. If we synthesize these data sets and can create a picture of overall biodiversity change in multiple forest patches, we can also use technology to look at the landscape change more in depth than we've been able to before. So we're saving time and energy and hoping to answer some of these questions that stakeholders have about what is happening in their forests and how might they manage it and what might it look like in the future.
Working with communities is a core aspect of all Chesapeake Working Land and Seascapes projects. The first thing we do is meet with stakeholders to discuss ecological issues and co-design research projects that address mutual conservation needs. We then involve these communities in every stage of the project, collecting data, sharing results, exchanging knowledge, and implementing local conservation practices. Community-driven science applies to our research not only in landscapes, but also in seascapes, where many groups have been working to restore populations of important fishery species, like river herring and oysters.
River herring are like salmon in that they spend their adult lives out in the ocean, and then every spring they migrate hundreds to thousands of miles up into estuaries like the Chesapeake Bay, and then eventually into freshwater streams and ponds to spawn. And most critically, because of their migrations from the ocean up into fresh water, river herring provide a vital link between those marine food webs and freshwater food webs. So the moving of nutrients and the moving of energy between those systems. Throughout the last 100 years, due to problems like overfishing and bycatch and habitat destruction, the damming of rivers that prevent these spawning migrations, their populations have cratered. They no longer serve the same ecological benefit or the same value to human communities that they once did. With our projects, we are working with a network of partners and stakeholders. These include private landowners and public and private organizations to study river herring. So we study those migrations, we monitor them as they move upstream, we monitor their spawning activity, and we have a project modeling the temperature regimes of different watersheds in the bay and the bay itself to understand how temperature patterns are driving the migration of those fish and how climate change is impacting those migrations.
Studying river herring and their habitats can help scientists and stakeholders mitigate the effects of land and water use to help these populations recover. Our work in the bay and its tributaries also leads us to study oyster reefs. Like river herring, oysters create important connections between land and sea that keep the watershed healthy. They filter runoff from the land, protect shorelines, and support animals that move between terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems.
Oyster reefs are really interesting because they're a ecological habitat built by a living organism, and that's the same thing that happens with trees, but oysters are neat because they grow on top of each other and form these three-dimensional structures that can support animals and plants that live in the reef itself and don't move very much, as well as bigger fish species and recreationally and commercially important fish species that swim by the reef and use that for foraging grounds.
Due to factors like intensive harvesting and disease, oyster populations in the Chesapeake Bay have been declining since the 19th century.
Yeah, so the oyster declines in the Chesapeake Bay do mirror what's been happening on a global scale in many other places around the world. But in the Chesapeake Bay, it's really neat because more recently there have been a lot of restoration programs and efforts to try to rebuild oyster reefs. One of the things I'm doing is studying oyster habitat across the whole bay, which nobody's done it at that scale before, and that can help us learn a lot more about the environmental and human factors that are driving healthy habitats.
Conditions in forests, rivers, and oyster reefs all emphasize that the watershed is facing multiple challenges. But in many ways, the Chesapeake Bay watershed is an ongoing success story. We have a terrific track record of noticing and mitigating problems in watershed health. Chesapeake Working Land and Seascapes builds on this track record and harnesses this energy by engaging a diversity of perspectives and skill sets more than ever before. Through science and collaboration, we can innovate nature-based solutions and build a brighter future for the communities and species that call the Chesapeake Bay watershed home.